4 years ago, on a flawlessly designed stage in Beijing, under the splendor of the Winter Olympics, something extraordinary happened. Something the world would only understand much later. When Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping stepped in front of the cameras that February day, they didn't just sign a declaration, they issued a manifesto, a direct challenge to Western hegemony. When they announced their so-called no-limits friendship, a chilling silence fell across every capital from Washington to Brussels. The West believed it, the generals in the Kremlin believed it, and for a long time, the rest of the world believed it too. Two nuclear giants, side by side, inseparable. The rising sun of the East shielding Moscow from every storm the West could throw at it. For years, a single legend circulated in diplomatic whispers behind closed doors. China will never abandon Russia. No matter how hard the West strikes, Beijing will protect Moscow. It was a comforting myth for the Kremlin, a dangerous one for the rest of us. But then came Munich, February 2026, cold, gray skies over Bavaria. And in those sterile, solemn halls of the Munich Security Conference, that legend quietly breathed its last. Welcome to World Brief Daily. If you're new here, make sure you subscribe and hit the notification bell, because this story is not just about Ukraine or Russia. It is about the secret reordering of the entire global balance of power, and you don't want to miss what comes next. Now, let's start with what happened on February 13th, 2026, because that date is going to matter to historians. China's top diplomatic heavyweight Foreign Minister Wang Yi sat down with Ukrainian Foreign Minister Andriy Sybiha on the sidelines of the Munich Security Conference. In and of itself, that's not explosive. Diplomats meet all the time. But what came out of that meeting was nothing short of a seismic shock for Moscow. As reported by Ukrainska Pravda, Sybiha announced that Beijing had committed to providing Ukraine with an additional humanitarian energy assistance package. Sybiha himself posted on social media, and I'm paraphrasing his words precisely here, that he was grateful for Beijing's decision to provide that additional package. Ukraine's foreign ministry confirmed it publicly. No secrets, no back channels, done in the open, in Munich, with the world watching. The effect in Moscow? Imagine a bunker-busting bomb dropped into the Kremlin's strategic planning rooms. Think about what this actually means on the ground. For the past 3 months, the Russian army has been conducting a systematic, brutal offensive specifically designed to destroy Ukraine's energy infrastructure. Transformer stations, power transmission lines. The strategy is cold and deliberate. Putin's generals calculated that if you freeze Ukrainian civilians in the dark, if you drain the country of heat and electricity through the bitter winter, Kiev will collapse at the negotiating table. General Winter fighting alongside General Putin. But here is where China steps in and says, I will repair everything Russia breaks. According to reporting by Euromaidan Press, Beijing had already provided Ukraine with 2,500 generators and 65 industrial transformers before this latest announcement. Now it is adding more, larger, more powerful, directly targeting the infrastructure Russia's missiles have been destroying. This is not charity. This is not neutral. This is the deliberate, calculated sabotage of Russia's entire winter military strategy, one Chinese generator at a time. And it gets worse for Moscow, because after the meeting, Sybiha announced something that sent a second shockwave through the Kremlin. He confirmed he had personally invited Wang Yi to visit Ukraine, and that the Chinese foreign minister had accepted. Think about that for a moment. China's top diplomat walking the streets of Kiev, under the threat of Russian missiles, potentially taking cover when the sirens go off. If that visit happens, Putin's carefully constructed narrative of global alliances crumbles in real time, broadcast live to the entire world. Now, before we go deeper, I want to pause here and address something that matters. China is not some naive peace broker. Let's be completely honest about that. With one hand, Beijing has been selling dual-use technologies and chips to Russia, components that end up in Russian drones, components that Ukrainian forces have been pulling out of wreckage on the front lines for 2 years. The Russian Defense Ministry knows this. The Ukrainian Defense Ministry knows this. Everyone knows this. And yet China kept the pipeline open. Because this is Beijing's strategy in its purest form: controlled chaos, supply both sides, profit from the conflict, keep all doors open, and never let anyone forget who holds the keys. As reported by USA News Pravda, Sybiha even briefed Wang Yi directly on the damage Russian strikes have caused to Chinese companies operating in Ukraine. This detail is extraordinary. Ukraine is essentially telling China, your own businesses are being hurt by your allies' bombs. The implicit message is almost audible in the silence between the diplomatic lines, and this dual game is getting harder to hide. Here's where it gets interesting. At the same Munich conference, French President Emmanuel Macron delivered what can only be described as a diplomatic execution speech about Russia. He stated that Moscow has now become a vassal state, entirely dependent on China rather than an independent actor. His exact framing described Russia as economically isolated, utterly reliant on Beijing, and having sacrificed hundreds of thousands of young lives to what he called an illusion. These are not the words of a nervous European leader hedging his bets. These are the words of a continent that has stopped being afraid. And this new European posture has its own consequences. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz has fundamentally changed the calculus. His predecessor's cautious, careful, don't rock the boat approach is gone. Merz stood alongside UK Prime Minister Starmer and French President Macron in Munich in a way that communicated a single message. Europe is back, and it has teeth. Defense budgets are rising across the continent at a pace not seen since the Cold War. This unified, rearmed European bloc prompted Beijing to recalculate its own position. Xi Jinping is no longer looking at a scattered, divided Western Europe. He is looking at a consolidated, resolute bloc that has dramatically increased its strategic weight. And then Finnish President Alexander Stubb delivered what may have been the most cutting words of the entire conference. He stated bluntly that Putin has failed strategically. He wanted to make Ukraine Russian. Instead, Ukraine became European. The war Russia launched specifically to prevent NATO expansion has produced, in Stubb's words, the greatest boomerang effect in history. Finland and Sweden are now NATO members. The Baltic Sea is effectively a NATO lake. The Russian Navy has been virtually driven from the Black Sea, its ships confined to port. Moscow's once feared military prestige, the prestige that underpinned decades of Russian foreign policy leverage, has been shattered. And now, the one ally Russia thought it had, the one partner that was supposed to shield it from all of this, is repairing its enemy's power grid. This is the moment when we need to step back, because if we just look at Munich as a diplomatic event, we miss the deeper story entirely. The real earthquake is economic, and it has been building for over a year. Let's look at the ledger. The cold, hard mathematics that governs every decision Beijing makes. The Beijing administration does not act on emotion. It has been governed by strategic calculation for centuries, and the 2025 data had been sending alarm bells ringing for months before Munich. According to Reuters and China's General Administration of Customs, two-way trade between Russia and China fell to approximately $228 billion in 2025. That represents a decline of roughly 6.9% compared to the previous year, according to data cited by Russia's trade representative to China, Alexei Dakhnovsky. This was the first annual decline in Russia-China trade since the COVID disruptions of 2020. After 4 consecutive years of record-breaking growth, the partnership had hit a wall, and the reasons behind that decline tell a devastating story about Russia's vulnerability. As reported by the Moscow Times, the decline was largely driven by falling oil prices. But here's the detail that cuts deepest. China did not reduce the volume of oil it bought from Russia in 2025. The valves stayed open. The tankers kept moving. However, the total value of what China paid for that oil collapsed. According to Reuters calculations based on Chinese customs data for the first 11 months of 2025, the value of China's crude oil imports from Russia fell by 19.6%. China is buying Russia's lifeblood at a discount, a steep one, and the discount is widening. According to oilprice.com, Russian crude is currently being offered at discounts of more than $11 per barrel below Brent benchmark prices for shipments to China. Russia is not selling oil. It is liquidating it, selling its most strategic resource at a loss simply to keep its war economy from seizing up entirely. The situation is even more stark when you look at where Russia sells its oil. As Russian Deputy Prime Minister Alexander Novak acknowledged, approximately 80% of Russia's 2025 oil exports went to just 2 countries, China and India. And as India has begun pulling back, pivoting away from Russian crude following U.S. sanctions on Rosneft and Lukoil, China has effectively become Russia's only reliable buyer. The Center for Research on Energy and Clean Air reported in November 2025 that China accounted for 45% of Russia's total fossil fuel export revenues. Moscow has no leverage in that negotiation, none. It cannot walk away. It cannot threaten. It can only accept the price Beijing sets, and Beijing sets a brutal one. Meanwhile, the collapse of China's car exports to Russia told an equally stark story. According to the China Passenger Car Association, Chinese vehicle exports to Russia in volume terms fell by approximately 46% year on year in the first 11 months of 2025. The Russian consumer squeezed dry by a war economy running at full tilt, by hyperinflation, by interest rates that have strangled domestic demand, simply stopped buying. The demand that once filled Russian streets with Chinese branded vehicles has evaporated. The Arctic is where the deeper strategic picture becomes truly alarming. Beijing's revision of the Northern Silk Road, the Arctic transit route that Russia had long considered its exclusive strategic asset, has fundamentally shifted the ownership of that corridor. Satellite data and leaked port protocols from early 2026 suggest that China has positioned its icebreaker fleet and logistics infrastructure in the region not as Russia's guests, but as the new operational authorities. The Arctic, which Putin had wielded as a strategic trump card against Western shipping, has become a direct Beijing to Europe trade highway, one that bypasses Russian territorial control and, critically, bypasses Russian toll collection entirely. Russia's massive natural gas projects in the Arctic, Yamal and Arctic LNG-2, have stalled. China's financial support, initially promised, has been conditioned on Beijing's own technology and labor, effectively restructuring the ownership of those assets. The gas may flow through Russian pipelines, but the economic architecture around those pipelines is being rebuilt with Chinese specifications. And then there is the most chilling dimension of all, the military one. Every Russian brigade deployed to the Ukrainian front represents a security vacuum somewhere in the vast expanse of Siberia and the Russian Far East. Chinese paramilitary units, officially described as protection forces or modernization teams, have been filling those vacuums quietly. While Russian engineers are dying in the trenches of Zaporizhzhia, Chinese engineers are reportedly working along the Trans-Siberian Railway under the banner of infrastructure modernization, Russia's most strategically vital rail corridor, the spine of its eastern empire. The tanks that once lined up on the Chinese border, projecting Russian military power eastward, are rusting in Ukrainian mud. And Beijing is filling the space left behind. One checkpoint, one logistics hub, one strategic corridor at a time. Does the Kremlin see this? Without question. The FSB, Russian military intelligence, the general staff. They see all of it. But the economic reality of 2026 has left Moscow without options. Russia is no longer a strategic partner. It has become a service provider, a commodity exporter with no leverage, no alternatives, and no capacity to push back. And that is precisely the paradox at the heart of Putin's situation. The great theater he staged in Beijing 4 years ago, the no limits declaration, the grand alliance against the West, turned out to be a trap of his own making. Xi Jinping used Russia as a battering ram, deployed it against the West, let it exhaust itself. And now, while Moscow is wounded, Beijing is not rescuing it. Beijing is collecting. Every generator China sends to Ukraine makes Russia's targeting of Ukrainian power infrastructure strategically worthless. Every piece of Chinese infrastructure established in Siberia draws a curtain over what was once Russia's imperial heartland. Every percentage point of discount on Russian oil represents a transfer of wealth, sovereignty, and leverage from Moscow to Beijing, quietly, legally, without a single shot fired. And here we reach the question that truly matters, the one that goes beyond the headlines. Does Russia still have a card to play? Is there any remaining deterrent that gives Moscow leverage against this silent acquisition of its strategic assets? The obvious answer is nuclear deterrence. Russia's arsenal remains real. It remains capable. But here is the question that haunts the strategic analysts, the one nobody in official circles will discuss openly. How many of the systems managing and communicating with that nuclear arsenal contain Chinese manufactured chips and components? How dependent is Russia's command and control infrastructure on Chinese made electronics, Chinese designed software, Chinese supply chains? If that dependence is significant, then even Russia's last card may carry a hidden asterisk. This is not speculation designed to alarm. It is the logical endpoint of a process that has been unfolding for 3 years. As Western components became unavailable and Russian defense procurement turned increasingly eastward to the only supplier still willing to sell. Now, here is where this story becomes genuinely complex, because what looks like a straightforward Chinese victory over Russia is actually a tightrope walk with no safety net. If you are watching this on World Brief Daily for the first time, subscribe now, because this next part is where the real danger lies. Not for Russia, for all of us. China cannot afford to let Russia collapse. This is the critical constraint that Beijing strategists are running calculations on every single day. Because behind every Chinese move toward Ukraine, every generator delivered to Kyiv, every diplomatic handshake in Munich, there is a scenario playing out in the Pacific that changes everything. The Taiwan scenario. When China eventually moves toward Taiwan, and in the strategic time frame of Beijing's planners, that calculation is being made right now, it will face the largest coordinated economic blockade in modern history. The United States Navy controls the Strait of Malacca, the choke point through which the majority of China's energy imports flow. The moment that strait is contested or closed, China's industrial economy faces an energy crisis of catastrophic proportions. Its factories, its grid, its military supply chains, all of them depend on imported energy. On that day, China will have one lifeline, One pipeline, one border where supplies can still flow, the Russian border, Russian oil, gas, and grain. The only energy corridor that the U.S. Pacific Fleet cannot reach. If Beijing has allowed Russia to collapse, if it has driven the Putin government to the point of regime change and installed an unpredictable successor, those Russian valves could be closed or controlled by someone whose cooperation cannot be guaranteed. That is why the Munich Gambit is so precisely calibrated. Xi Jinping does not want Russia strong. He wants Russia weak, dependent, and manageable. He wants Moscow just functional enough to keep the gas flowing, just fragile enough to ask no questions, and just humiliated enough to accept the terms China sets. It is not charity. It is inventory management of a strategic reserve. But there is a darker variant of this scenario that is keeping analysts awake in Beijing. What happens if Russia, pushed past its tolerance threshold, seeks alternative alignment? What happens if Moscow, desperate and cornered, deepens its partnership not just with North Korea, which it has already done in the supply of artillery shells and ballistic missiles, but in a more comprehensive military and strategic sense? At that point, China would find itself bordered to the north by a volatile nuclear-armed Russia-North Korea alliance that it cannot control, to the east by the US, Japan, South Korea defensive perimeter, and to the south by an increasingly assertive India and its strategic partners. That ring of containment is the nightmare at the center of Xi Jinping's strategic calculations. This is why China's move in Munich was not, as Western commentators rushed to declare, evidence that Beijing is switching sides. It was a precisely measured pressure signal. It was Beijing telling Moscow, you need us. You will remain in your lane. You will accept what we offer and not ask for more. While simultaneously performing responsibility and constructive engagement for European audiences, for Macron and Merz and the new European defense bloc, signaling that China can be a useful partner in the eventual peace settlement. Two birds, one stone, executed in the most calculated diplomatic theater of the decade. But tightropes snap, and this one is under extraordinary tension. Because proud nations, even wounded ones, have a way of exhausting their capacity for humiliation before their rulers exhaust their capacity for calculation. The history of the 20th century is full of cornered regimes making irrational decisions that ended in catastrophe. Putin has publicly stated his red lines repeatedly and emphatically. A Russia that has been stripped of its Arctic assets, whose nuclear communications infrastructure may be compromised by Chinese components, whose only major trading partner is simultaneously repairing the enemy's power grid, is a Russia that has had those red lines crossed in every direction simultaneously. No one should assume that the response will be rational. When that photograph of Wang Yi shaking hands with Zelensky in Kiev is eventually published, and the indications from Munich are that it will be, the repercussions in Moscow will land harder than any missile on any front line. The humiliation of it, the finality of it, the public undeniable proof that China has chosen its side, not Ukraine's side, not peace, China's own side, which is ultimately the only side that matters to Beijing. So where does this leave us? Where does all of this end? Approximately 80% of the answer is buried in cold economic data. Oil barrel prices, exchange rates, trade volumes, discount spreads, reserve drawdown rates, the Russian federal budget's dependency on energy revenues that are shrinking in value with every quarter. These are the variables that will determine the timeline of Russia's strategic capacity, its ability to sustain the war, to maintain social cohesion, to keep the security services loyal and the generals in line. The remaining 20%, the part that no algorithm can model, the part that makes every strategic forecast ultimately provisional, depends on the fragile, unpredictable egos of men who have built their entire identity around never being seen to lose. You cannot calculate what a cornered dictator will do with a spreadsheet. History has tried. History has been wrong, consistently and catastrophically. What we can say with confidence is this. The world that existed when Putin and Xi stood together on that Olympic stage in February 2022 no longer exists. The no-limits partnership that was supposed to make Russia invincible has instead made it dependent. The Arctic that was supposed to be Russia's inland sea is becoming Beijing's logistics corridor. The energy that was supposed to fund Russia's reconquest of its imperial periphery is being sold at a discount to the country that is simultaneously repairing its enemy's power grid. Munich was not just a diplomatic meeting. Munich was the moment that the architecture of that Beijing declaration visibly began to collapse. And what rises from those ruins, whether it is a negotiated peace, a managed Russian retreat, or something far darker and more unstable, will define the shape of the global order for the decades that follow. We will, of course, keep you updated here on World Brief Daily as this story continues to develop. because it is far from over. If you found this analysis valuable, if it gave you a sharper picture of what is actually happening behind the headlines, then please subscribe to World Brief Daily and share this video. Every share helps us keep this kind of deep, sourced, independent analysis going. And if you have questions or perspectives, leave them in the comments. We read them all. Thank you for watching and stay informed.